Today, let's build a 12 foot by 16 foot deck at my property in upstate New York. So I'm going to be building this basically on the ground, and this is something that I've wanted to do for a while. If you're familiar with my channel at all, you know that a couple years ago I bought a property in upstate New York in East Durham near my friend Jimmy DiResta. And when I bought it, the property had a basically blighted home on it. So eventually I saved up enough money to have the house knocked down, and then I bought a camper from a friend that my wife and I renovated, and it's been sitting here ever since. It's a great property and a great camper, but it needs a place for us to hang out on when we're over at the property. You can see that my driveway is basically what some people call gravel, but it's large shale. And shale is a great driveway substrate, but it's not so comfortable to sit around on. So we're going to be building this deck out of some pressure treated material that I picked up from the home center. And we're going to be starting out by laying out some frames on the ground. And you'll notice that I'm building this deck in two pieces. Now I'll put a little set of plans up on the screen so you can see sort of what I was planning here. But basically I'm framing this all in 2x6s, and my goal is to do as little cutting as possible so that I can save myself time. And so I have 16 foot wide is what I'm going for. So I have 8 foot boards going sort of parallel with the camper, and then 12 foot boards going perpendicular to it. So my goal here is going to be framing the deck in 2 sections so that I can move it around while not only framing it, but also if I ever need to move it in order to move the camper out from behind it. Now I start by framing out this one section, but I want to talk a little bit about how I loaded my material at the home center to do this project. All right, something that's often overlooked when you're doing a project like this is how you load the material onto your vehicle. So what you'll notice here is all my deck boards are on the bottom because those will be the last thing that I put on. And then my framing material is kind of strategically stacked on top of that. All my 8 foot material is over here on its own, and then my 12 footers are here. The reason I did it like that is because I don't want to have to move all the 8 foot material to get to the 12 foot material. All I've got to move is a couple of 4x4s, which I'm going to be using for leveling. So when you're loading your vehicle, when you're doing a project like this, try to think about how you're going to actually use the material so you can unload really efficiently. So my goal was to build this deck in one day, and of course the day that my wife and I went up to the camper to do this, it basically rained on and off for the entire time. Now what you can't really see in this clip is that I'm working underneath the awning of my camper, so all the stuff that I normally keep under it to keep it out of the rain was off to the right, and every time it would start to rain I'd have to move everything back under the camper and so on and so forth. So getting this done was a huge priority so I could get everything back up on the deck. So what you see me doing here is you see me laying out the framing for the second section. Now I measured out my 16 on center for the first section, and then instead of measuring again, I just laid my framing board against it and transferred those lines across. When you're framing anything like this, even if you're framing wall sections, once you have one good layout, it's very common to sort of use that as a story pole to lay out your other sections. You know, you want to reduce the opportunities for error, and error occurs when you're measuring, especially when you're working by yourself. So with those lines marked out, I could continue to frame. Now I'm using a cordless framing nailer and some 3¼ inch galvanized nails that are rated for pressure treated lumber. If you're going to build anything out of pressure treated, make sure you use the correct nails. Now you may be wondering why my framing looks like it's spaced so far apart, and there's a reason behind that. I wanted to be able to move these deck sections around, and the only way I was going to be able to do that by myself was to reduce that framing weight until everything was in place. So I'm actually going to go back and add additional framing, but you can see how I'm able to kind of wiggle things around and make sure things are, in the right spot. I also didn't really know how level the site was until I built these 2 pads. You saw me with the big 8 foot level there, but it's very hard to level a large grade surface like this unless you have a transit laser or another sort of layout tool. So I thought my best way to do that would be to make the pads, and then I could move them around, check for level, and really understand what I was dealing with. I'm going to be lifting the whole block up on these little piers called Tuffblocks in a little bit, but in order to know where my grade stood, I wanted to have a nice pad for me to move around. You can see me adding the additional framing. I'm face nailing and toe nailing everything and really being liberal with the amount of fasteners I use here. I'd rather have them and not need them than need them and not have them. And you may notice too that that framing nailer has a really long clip on it. I have the extension clip that Milwaukee makes for that nailer, which if you've ever used it, it really is helpful, but goddamn, that thing is heavy. So now that I've kind of figured things out and I'm checking for square, I can pull out these plastic Tuffblocks that I'm going to be using to get this thing up off the ground. Now these are a deck foundation block that you can use with a bunch of different types of material, 2x4, 4x4, nominal or actual, and you'll see how they work throughout this process here. Now, what I figured out was that the right side of the deck is actually going to be my low point, and the property sort of slopes down to the left. Now, I did have the challenge of trying to level between the two deck sections, but it was okay, and while it was a little challenging to get them perfectly flat, it wasn't impossible. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting some cribbing to go in between my framing. Now, there are different ways to do this, but what I wanted to do was cut some cribbing and then use that as kind of leveling blocks so that I could not waste any material by making spacers or anything else like that. I'm trying to get this block to level out the whole deck, and what I want here is a deck that is perfectly level, kind of left to right, but has a little bit of a pitch moving forward so that if I get snow or rain on it, it naturally wicks itself away from the camper. So you can see the way that I'm using the Tuffblocks in two separate kind of methods. One, I have my 2x material straddling across it, and the other, I have a 4x material sitting flat down in it. Now you can use these in either orientation, and they're really convenient for this. They have a great spread load on the shale, and in my case, I don't have to worry about compaction because this shale driveway is already extremely well compacted. I actually drove over it with my truck a couple times just to be 100% sure, but this thing's been sitting for a couple of years, so it's not going anywhere. I wanted to space these out about every 6 feet. The rule of thumb that I'm always kind of working on is whatever your dimension of your lumber is the distance in which you want it to support. So in this case, I'm using 2x6 lumber, so I don't want it to have to support more than 6 feet at any given time. I wound up going a little bit heavier on the deck supports because I just wanted this thing to be super solid, but you'll kind of get the idea as you see me frame through it. Now this method of putting in the 4x4 post to jack up the side of the deck that was lower, I think worked out pretty well. I'm using a PL premium construction adhesive to glue two sides of the 4x4 and then sticking them down into the Tuffblocks before nailing them in from the outside. Now you can see me starting to add the cribbing. I went with a staggered pattern here, and this just helped kind of make the whole deck more rigid. I think maybe you could have gotten away without this if you put a couple of supports in there, but it was pretty cheap insurance to add this stuff in. And I'm using kind of a Larry Hahn method where you just basically hold your 2x6 up and kind of sight it by eye and then cut straight down it with your saw in order to get that cut. So very little measuring. You can see I haven't taken my measuring tape out at all to cut these blocks, and they all wound up fitting pretty perfectly to get myself across. The only block that was missing was that one in the first course, and I stuck that in there with some glue and got that all set up. You can see me just cutting that last section right here. Now, obviously, if you are not as so comfortable with the circular saw, you could measure these out. And what I think is the most efficient way to do it is to measure out each bay and make a list of your cuts and try to cut them all at once versus actually measuring and cutting each individual bay. The best way to do this would be to have a second person on the saw cutting everything so that you don't have to kind of move yourself back and forth. So now with one of the deck sections all leveled and set up, I can go ahead and move on to the second one. Now, if you've ever built a kind of deck or a platform in two sections, you know that getting that crease in the center to be perfectly flat and not have an arch or a sag is really tricky. So my strategy here was to clamp these together with these kind of big Bessie clamps that I have and try to use some pry bars and some blocks to sort of get everything level so that I could set it and then move and continue on from there. What I wound up having to deal with here was kind of a low section in the center, and then the left side actually wound up kind of going back down. So there was kind of a natural swale in the driveway, and I wanted to make sure that I made this center section nice and level and even so that it didn't look awkward when you were looking at the deck as a whole. I decided to go ahead and screw the two sections together so that in case I ever needed to move them, it would be easy for me to do instead of having to pull a bunch of nails out. You'll notice when I put the actual decking down too, I don't put the center section of decking down with nails. I put it down with screws so that I can remove the center 3 boards in case I ever need to try to pull these two sections of deck away with the skid steer in order to move my trailer or bring anything else to the property. Leveling this part out is probably the trickiest part of this entire operation. I have an 8-foot level, but it's still hard to kind of sight down a 16-foot span and make sure there isn't any sort of weird discrepancies or, like I said, a high spot or a swale in the center. I made some temporary posts up just to kind of get me going and kind of did some temporary blocking along the way just to make sure that I was set perfect, and then I could go ahead and repeat the process that I did earlier with the Tuffblocks and the 4x4s to sort of get myself set up and get myself up off the ground. I'm continuing to use the PL glue here as well, just to make sure that these vertical supports wind up really holding to the deck platform. Using the PL, I feel like, is probably a good substitute for using kind of a lag bolt. I didn't really want to get involved in having to drill and use lags. So the PL is really what's going to be holding the deck up once it's dry. The nails in shear like that aren't very strong, and I'm sure there'll be some comments saying that there was a better way to do this. But after going back to the deck a couple months later, it's still really, really solid and it's not going anywhere. You'll notice there I snapped a line to put in my cribbing. You may have not seen that on the other side when I did it, but with that line, what it allows me to do is stagger my cribs so that every one that I put in, I'm easily able to nail from the outside and also toenail. Same method by just sort of sighting down the stud and cutting it with the circular saw. Every now and then I have to make a little bit of an adjustment with the saw, but that's easy once you get the hang of it. The other nice thing that the cribbing allows me to do is have a 90-degree corner for me to glue in more blocks. Now, unfortunately, the weekend that I went up to do this, it was like a heat wave, hottest weekend of the summer so far. So I was just drenched the entire weekend, and I kept having to go in and change my clothes and take breaks. And then on top of that, every now and then we'd get a little thunderstorm roll through, so I'd have to stop what I was doing and hide everything under the canopy. You can see here gluing and nailing in those other blocks, and you can see the way I'm using the Tuffblocks here. I pre-cut some of these 4x4 jack posts and basically just laid them in the blocks, pushed them down nice and firm, and then just nailed them off on the two sides so that once the glue dried, there was nowhere for them to go. You can see the way that the deck all looks nice and straight. All those joists look nice and straight, and I was really happy with the way this frame came out, despite the fact that I had to do it in two sections and I'd had some pretty uneven terrain to deal with. Now I went ahead and added some additional Tuffblocks on the side closest to the camera. You can see there's a pretty big gap in there, but otherwise I just sort of added them in as I needed and could start putting down my decking. Now my center deck board is going to cover that seam, and I wanted to make sure it was nice and centered. And like I said earlier, I'm going to screw these first three center boards down with screws so that if I ever need to remove them, I can pull them up without having to pull nails. And I started off by just basically doing screws in the outside, in the center, and on the end. And that's how I'm actually going to nail off the entire top of the platform. Now I decided to just use some 5/4x6 pressure treated deck boards. I was going to use like a composite decking, but I want this to weather, and then eventually I'm going to seal and stain it so that it lasts for a while. But I'm not a huge fan of the composite decking. I like a more natural kind of silver wood look. This will be able to breathe, and it'll be able to kind of expand and contract with the elements up here. This is going to be in basically full sun when the canopy on the camper is put away. So I want to make sure that, this is going to be able to weather and not become really, really hot like some of that Trex decking I've heard can get pretty hot. Now here's the process of just nailing down these deck boards. I actually used a really heavy kind of railroad spike as a spacer, and you can see me just putting it in there as I walk my way down the board and doing 2 nails in each piece of framing and kind of just doing the outside, center, and the inside of each board as I go. Just sort of straightening things out as I move along. And my goal here was just to get this decking down and pull it out of my truck the way that I showed earlier in the video, the way it was all laid out in there. This is a really fast process. It goes down in about 15 minutes. You can put down an entire section of decking like that. And then I can move on to the other side. Again, securing that board with some screws so that my center 3 boards can be pulled up and I can get to that seam. And then I can go back with the nailer and nail off the rest. I'm using these Velocity 3.5-inch decking screws. They're gray, and they'll blend in really well once the deck has kind of silvered out a little bit. Now back with the nails, just kind of setting and nailing every board as I move through it. And again, super fast process, and it's nice to be able to use the nailer face down like that because, man, this thing gets pretty heavy, and it definitely is less on your shoulder when you're just nailing straight down. Some of these boards were really wet, but they did dry out nicely when I came back to the camper a couple weeks later. You can see some of them have a little bit of a bow to them, and I just sort of use my shin to kind of level things out and even things out as I go. Eventually, I did run out of material, but it was okay. It started to rain, so I ran out to the lumber yard to grab a couple more pieces of decking, and I could finish nailing this off. Now, the last board basically had kind of like a 2/3 of a board left on it. So what I wound up doing was nailing that board in and then snapping a line so that I could rip it. Now, the next thing I wanted to do was make up a step for where you walk into the camper. Now, there's a kind of flip down step that you would normally use to get in and out of the camper, but with the decking being probably about 8 inches off the ground now, that step wasn't going to work out. So I grabbed some leftover 2x6 material that I had, and I banged together this platform that would be just a little bit wider than the step that was there. I nailed this all together and left sort of the back of it open so that it could kind of straddle around the step, and you'll see that in a second when I get back over to the step so that I could mark out for the scribe that I'm going to use to put the deck boards on the top. The step on the camper has a little bit of a curve to it, so I need to accommodate for that with my deck boards. In the end, this will wind up being almost a 7-inch step, and it's actually really comfortable getting in and out of the camper with just one step to get you in between the top of the deck and the actual entrance of the camper. It's about 15 inches altogether, so you wind up with like a nice 7-inch step on both sides, and it does work out really well. Here you can see where I have to scribe around that curved front of the metal piece of the step. And I just use a jigsaw with a pretty aggressive blade to cut around that curve so I can nail this back on. The interesting kind of design challenge here was that the step wasn't centered on the door, but I wanted my step to be centered on the door. So the actual curve I cut for the factory step had to be offset. And unfortunately, my camera decided to go out of focus here, but you can see I also cut little 45-degree back cuts in the framing so that it would just look a little more aesthetically pleasing. And I screwed this down to the deck with some screws, so in case I ever wanted to remove it, I didn't have to deal with any nails. You can see how nice that looks and how well it fits. Moving back over to actually make that cut on the decking. When I went to do it earlier, I believe it started to rain. That's why I had to kind of set that board and walk away from it. You can see how misty and kind of foggy it is in the shot right now. Like I said, I was contending with some pretty bad weather throughout this entire day of building this deck. And I was very happy to get it done, though, because as I was finishing it, I could put stuff back under the awning and keep it protected. So very simple, just made myself a little track using another board, and then I could nail off this deck board completely and finish it up. I left a little bit of an overhang, probably about 5/8, and it came out really nice. So you have just a little bit of a way for the water to wick off that side of the deck. While I was over here, I figured I could start nailing off the actual deck boards, and I'm just doing 2 nails in each board as I go and just running through the entire platform. All in all, I think I used about 1,500 nails for this. I bought a box of 1,000 and I ran through that, and then I used probably about half a box that I had already. And like I said, I used all 3.5 or 3.25 galvanized nails that are rated for use in pressure treated. I really did have a great time though using this battery powered nailer from Milwaukee. I have that extended clip, which made a huge difference. Normally this nailer only holds 1 sleeve of nails, but with the extended clip you can get 2 in there, which definitely helps a lot for efficiency. Now the other thing I had to contend with throughout this whole process was all the stuff that was on the deck because I kept having to move it out of the rain, but it wasn't so bad just kind of moving through and nailing everything off. As I worked my way across, the last thing for me to do was cut that last kind of edge board, and I used what was left over from the board I cut on the other side. I left the factory edge facing in so that I could have 2 matching factory edges, and one of these days when I head back up there, I'll bring a palm router with a round over bit and I'll round over the edge of this board so that it looks nice and even with the rest of them. I snapped a line just as a reference and still went ahead and clamped down a piece of decking so that I would have a nice guide board that I could use to run my saw against. I didn't have my track saw here, but you can definitely get a nice clean cut with any regular old circular saw, especially if you use a guide block like this. When this was done, it looked really, really straight and worked out super well. Pop that off, and again, I can continue to nail. You can see how I added some additional tough blocks on this side. There's 5 on the sides, and there's a whole bunch of them strewn about inside the rest of the framing. Last thing I had to do was finish screwing off those 3 center boards, and this thing is done. So it's 16 feet wide by 12 feet deep, and it turned out really, really awesome. It's going to be a super great addition to this property, and it's really going to help us enjoy our camper.